Welcome and thank you for joining us today for our panel discussion, Guidance for Employers of Parents Navigating School and Work. Today's panelists are Kathleen Connolly, Stephen Fox, and Lisa Jingaleski, who are all members of Lindabury's Labor and Employment Practice Group. The COVID-19 pandemic has created unprecedented challenges for employers and employees alike. Based on data from the U.S. Department of Labor, it's estimated that 41% of workers between the ages of 20 and 54 have a child at home. It's also estimated that single parents make up approximately 30% of the workforce. As the school year begins in earnest, employers need to be aware of the leave protections available to employees and develop strategies that allow parents with school-aged children to remain productive members of their workforce. So let's start with leave rights. Kathleen, can you explain what leave rights are available to employees with school-aged children who will begin the school year with 100% remote learning?
Okay, there are multiple leave rights that are available to employees in this situation. The first two I want to talk about are the product of the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. These are temporary leave rights that are available to employees only through the end of the year, unless, of course, Congress decides to extend those leave rights. So there's two components under the FFCRA for leave. The first component is an emergency paid sick leave component. And under that leave right, employees, for purposes of caring for children, are eligible for 80 hours of paid leave, or 2 weeks, at full pay, up to a maximum of $200 per day. Now, once that leave is exhausted, there's a second leave right under the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. And that second component is what we call emergency paid family leave. And under that provision, you get an additional 10 weeks only for childcare purposes. Again, it's going to be paid at $200 per day maximum to eligible employees. So in total, under the FFCRA, employers who need to stay home to care for children have available 12 weeks of paid leave, up to the maximum of $200 a day for these situations. Now, the FFCRA only applies to employers with less than 500 employees. If you happen to be an employer who has more than 500 employees, it's important to remember employees still have leave rights under the New Jersey Family Leave Act. And under the New Jersey Family Leave Act, that employee would be eligible, again, for 12 weeks of leave, but in that circumstance, it would be an unpaid leave.
Okay.
Now, and again, a little bit more I want to add. Once those leave rights are exhausted, either the FFCRA leave rights or the traditional New Jersey Family Leave rights are exhausted, it's important to remember employees may also have some accrued New Jersey earned sick leave available to them, which they can also use for the purposes of caring for a child in the event of a school or daycare closure. So we have three components of leave, basically. The FFCRA earned sick leave, the FFCRA extended family leave, you have New Jersey family leave rights that have to be considered, and then you also have the earned sick leave benefits that employees may have available to them.
Okay. What about those students who are doing partial remote learning and partial in-class learning and are not there full time?
Okay, that's what we call an intermittent leave, where you're not taking it in blocks of time. And under the FFCRA, these leave rights that I'm talking about, that has to be agreed upon with the employer. However, the Department of Labor has made it very clear that they expect that employers will be cooperative with employees who need to make these adjustments. After all, everyone's suffering and we all have to try to cooperate. So we're encouraging all employers to please comply if you can and grant these leave intermittently to employees. Also important to remember, under the New Jersey Family Leave Act, which also gives leave for this purpose, the employee is able to elect to take the leave intermittently. So there's no point in an employer pushing back in the state of New Jersey, because no matter what we dice it, the employee can take some form of intermittent leave under our statutes.
Interesting. Okay. What if an employee cannot secure any aftercare for their student on days that they have in-class learning?
So this is a similar intermittent leave situation to what Kathleen just discussed. And those same rights that Kathleen addressed would apply under these circumstances. If a child's place of care, whether that's before school care or an after school care program, is either closed or operating at a reduced capacity as a result of COVID and no longer available to that child, then the parent, the working employee, would likely be eligible for leave under these circumstances. So one thing I do want to add, though, is that child care provider, the definition of child care provider under the Act, obviously includes those businesses and individuals who are traditionally paid to provide childcare, but it also extends to family members. So one situation that we will likely see is perhaps a grandparent who is traditionally the person responsible for watching a child after school hours. And now, due to COVID-19, that grandparent is no longer available because of health concerns. So that working parent doesn't have after school care for that program for their child through their grandparent or their own parent, I should say. Under those circumstances, that working employee would be eligible for leave as well.
Hmm. So what would be the situation if a child's school was open, but the parent doesn't feel safe sending their child to school? Are there leave rights available in this situation?
No, in this situation, those same leave rights are not available. So if a child's school is open for in-person instruction and the parent simply does not send the child either because they're concerned that the child will contract the virus or bring the virus home to another family member, they would not be eligible for leave rights. However, if that child is subject to quarantine, for example, if a nurse sends a child home or a healthcare provider suggests that that child undergo quarantine or self-isolation due to COVID, then under those circumstances, the parent, if they had to stay home to take care of the child during that quarantine period, then they would be eligible for leave.
So what do we do, if there's an employee who has a child with underlying health conditions that places that child in a high-risk category?
Well, in that circumstance, the leave rights are somewhat more limited. That situation would qualify for the earned paid sick leave rights, which is the 80 hours of leave time. So long as the employee submits a note from a physician demonstrating that the child is in fact in the compromised category. However, once those 80 hours of leave are expired, the individual can then continue under traditional FMLA because they're caring for a child who's compromised and cannot attend school because of an underlying illness.
So a lot of times, when we think about remote learning, we're thinking about younger elementary age school children. Are there any exceptions for older students that are more self-sufficient?
That's a fair question. Under the Act, the definition of child includes someone who is 17 years of age or younger. It also includes individuals who are 18 or older if they're incapable of self-care due to a mental or a physical impairment. However, in recognition of what you just mentioned, Rich, the Department of Labor has kind of carved out this caveat saying children who fall within the range of 15 to 17 are generally fairly independent and don't necessarily need a parent at home to take care of them. Often they're babysitting other people's children at this age. If a working employee is looking to take leave under these circumstances to provide care for a child who falls within this 15 to 17-year-old range, the employer can require a written explanation from the employee asking for special circumstances that warrant that working employee provide care. Now, the Department of Labor has not provided specific examples of what those special circumstances would entail, but presumably it would apply to a child with special needs.
Okay, interesting. Let's say that an employee needs to take leave. Is the employer required to return that employee to the same position at the conclusion of their leave?
Well, the employer is not necessarily required to return the employee to the exact same position, but the obligation is to return the employee to a comparable position, both in wages and in benefits and in advancement opportunity. So yes, this is essentially a protected leave.
Okay. So I can, envision a scenario where an employer needs to hire another individual to fill in for the employee that's taking leave for, to take care of their child that's doing remote learning. And let's say later that employee wants to come back from leave. What can be done with the employee that was hired to fill in that position? Can the employer simply terminate the second employee? Does the employer need to advise that second employee before hiring that, this is a possibility?
Rich, presumably, and I'm going to assume that it's an at-will employee. Yes, you can terminate the employee. The better practice is this, though. Okay, if you can find a comparable position for that second employee, and the second employee is working out well with the company, then place that employee somewhere else. The also better practice is that upon hiring that second employee, let that employee know that this could very well be a temporary position and that they are filling in for someone who is unavailable at this time for work. You don't have to get into details, but the better practice is to let that second employee know that this may be a temporary position.
Okay. Are there key employee or other exemptions to the requirement to provide leave?
Well, under the traditional FMLA, there is a key employer exception for very high-level individuals. However, under the FFCRA, for the emergency earned sick leave and the emergency family leave, there is no key employee exception. So every employee, no matter what their rank is, can invoke their rights to FFCRA family leave in order to care for a child. There are no exceptions. However, there is an exception to the reinstatement obligation that's limited to employers with 25 or less employees. Congress realized that the ability of these small employers to hold a position open during what could be 12 weeks of leave can be very difficult. So what they've said is, for a small employer of 25 or less, the employer can deny reinstatement if, and only if, the employer can show certain elements. If they can prove that the position was eliminated due to operational changes that were brought on by the COVID crisis, or the employer makes reasonable efforts to reinstate that employee after the crisis has ended, if they can. So if the position is revived, for example. And that obligation to consider reemploying that individual will last for 1 year period after the crisis has ended. So it's an ongoing obligation to keep that employee in your radar and reinstate them to a position if and when the opportunity arises. But I would caution people, if you're going to try to invoke that exception to the reinstatement obligation, that you had best be guided by employment law counsel, because you really want to vet it very carefully to make sure that it meets all the requirements for that very narrow exception that's available to an employer.
Okay. How much notice is an employer entitled to when an employee decides to take leave so they can take care of their child or children who are participating in remote learning?
That's a great question, because I think some schools don't even know if they're going to be opening up or not. The regulations indicate, or the interpretations, that when leave is foreseeable. Okay, I don't know how more ambiguous you can get with that, but it says that when leave is foreseeable, the employee should provide notice of the leave to the employer as is practical. Now, after the first workday that the person is on leave, the employer may require the employee to follow reasonable notice procedures, other procedures. But as far as the initial leave, all the guidance is basically when leave is foreseeable. So that's really, unfortunately, ambiguous.
Is there any kind of documentation that the employer has to submit to their employer to request to take leave?
Yes, there is. And I'll read exactly what the interpretation is. They indicate that if there's going to be leave based on school closing or child care providers unavailable, there has to be, number one, a statement from the employee which includes the name and age of the child or children to be cared for. Two, the name of the school that has closed or place of care that is unavailable. And three, a representation that no other person will be providing care for the child or children during the period for which the employee is receiving the family medical leave. And with respect to an employee's inability to work or telework because of the need to provide for care of a child older than 14 during daylight hours, a statement that special circumstances exist requiring the employee to provide care. Now, of course, an employer, if they want, they can always call up PS 123 or whatever school just to confirm that the school is closed. But those are the documentation that has to be submitted to the school.
Okay, great. Are there any small employer exemptions to the FFCRA?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, there are. If you have 50 employees or less, then according to the DOL, small business may claim an exemption if an officer of the business determines the following. Now, I want to also let you know that these exemptions are high. You better make sure you meet them if you're ever audited. But first one is that providing the emergency PSL or emergency FMLA would result in the business expenses or financial obligations exceeding the available business revenues and causing the business to cease operating at a minimum capacity. So almost like a draconian effect on the business. Number two, the absence of that employee requesting leave would entail a substantial risk to the financial health or operation capabilities of that business because of their specialized skills, knowledge of the business or responsibilities. Or three, they're not sufficient workers, able to, willing, and qualified, and who will be available when needed to perform the services of that employee requesting leave. And these labor or services are needed for the small business to operate at a minimum capacity. So these are very, very stringent, very high thresholds that an employer will have to satisfy in order to be exempt from providing the benefits to the employees.
And again, I just want to follow up. I think every employer has to really keep in mind that everybody is struggling through this, and we all have to work together. And these poor parents who have children at home and now they're doing some remote learning, parents don't know which way to turn, and they're struggling, and they're being torn between taking care of their families and making a living. So, we really encourage employers to work with them as best you can and try to be as flexible as you can so that we can all kind of get through this crisis and hopefully at some point get back to work in the new normal, whatever that's going to be.
Well, that's great. I appreciate that insight that everyone here has provided today. I'd like to thank all of our panelists, Kathleen, Steve, Lisa. I think that you did a great job in providing employers with an overview of situations they can expect to face in the coming weeks as their employers are asked to juggle their work responsibilities along with the educational needs of their families and their children.
And what, excuse me, Rich, but one more comment I really, really want to caution employers about as well. This topic is deceptively difficult. And navigating all of these leave rights is treacherous. And you have to deal with it on a day-to-day basis because there's so many layers to it. So my parting advice is don't go it alone. Make sure you have the qualified professional to guide you through these leave rights because it's so easy to trip up. And we've only touched the surface. There's a lot more to it than what we've touched upon in the short time that we had together. So please don't hesitate to pick up the phone and reach out for your employment law counsel or other professional who is well-versed in these leave rights.
That's excellent. I encourage anyone with questions about how their business should handle these or any other employment-related matters, please feel free to reach out and contact any one of today's presenters using the contact information that's shared on your screen now. Thank you, everyone, for watching today's presentation. We look forward to speaking with you. Take care.